Okay, welcome everyone to Exploring Ecological Forestry. Today's session will be moderated by Liz Thompson, the managing editor of From the Ground Up. I will turn it over to Liz.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Exploring Ecological Forestry. I'm Liz Thompson, managing editor of From the Ground Up, the quarterly online magazine that supports an integrated vision of land conservation, one that includes passively managed wildlands, carefully managed forests, vibrant farmlands, and healthy human communities. Let me start with some logistics. You can ask questions using the Q&A feature. Just click on the button at the bottom of your screen and we'll hear from our panelists first, and then we will take questions. We've allowed plenty of time for that at the end. The chat feature of Zoom will be disabled shortly. It's great to see so many people signing in and letting us know where you're from. This is exciting. Great to see you all. But it will be disabled soon. But you can always chat the host, publisher Marissa Latshaw, with any technical questions. And the webinar will end promptly at noon Eastern Time. So now on to the interesting part. In our most recent issue of From the Ground Up, we focused on one aspect of this vision, ecological forestry. Today, we have 7 of the contributors to the issue to help us better understand this concept, its origins, its ethical underpinnings, and its practice. I'll briefly introduce each panelist here at the beginning and invite you to read more about them in From the Ground Up or the materials we sent you ahead of time. So these are very brief introductions for now. So we're going to start with Tony D'Amato. Tony is the director of the Forestry Program at the University of Vermont, and he's published numerous books, research papers, popular articles, and manuals on ecological forestry and related topics. Then we'll have Brian Donahue, an editor of From the Ground Up. Brian is professor emeritus at Brandeis University and a farm and forest policy consultant. He has written extensively on conservation, forest management, and food systems. Then we're going to hear from Rick Morrill, who's a consulting forester in northern Vermont, together with his wife, an ecologist, and his father-in-law. Rick is a practicing forester with over 50 years in the woods. His experience managing Baxter State Park in Maine has shaped his worldview and his work here in Vermont with private landowners. Then we're going to hear from Annie Sachi Maloney and Guy Dunkel. Annie is executive director of the Pennsylvania-based Foundation for Sustainable Forests, and Guy is director of land management for the foundation. Together, they offer perspectives on the challenges of managing in the face of invasives, overabundant deer, and climate change. Then we'll have Sam Brown. Sam was a pioneer and is an active implementer of Maine's low-impact forestry. From his early work on his own land and with neighbors to his more recent outreach efforts with Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, he has influenced hundreds of forest owners in Maine and elsewhere. And then finally, David Foster, an editor of From the Ground Up, will conclude our presentation. David is an ecologist and director emeritus of the Harvard Forest. He co-founded the Wildlands and Woodlands initiative in 2005 and was the lead author of Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future in 2023. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Tony D'Amato.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for the introduction, Liz, and for all the folks logging in. I really appreciate the interest in the topic. So as Liz mentioned, my role here is to try to provide some framing, just an overview of what we're talking about ecological forestry, at least how some of us envision that as a topic, and then get in a little bit into the history of where ecological forestry has come from and where we are today and how that fits into different visions for how we might steward our forests into the future. Next slide, please. So I'm going to begin with just a bit of history. And again, I have 10 minutes, so it's going to be a brief history of ecological forestry and where it comes from. And to start with that, I think it's worthwhile just having some context for how we define this term and how we think about that and its integration with our stewardship on the landscape. So you can advance to the next slide. So today, when we think about ecological forestry, it's a term that many people use, and I would argue there's a lot of confusion and different interpretations of how that applies to different areas, as well as what exactly are we talking about. And so I've put up a definition that Brian Palak and others have advanced that really I think underpins a few key things, particularly as we get into the history of ecological forestry and what it's built upon. And the first is that, really the foundation for our actions across a landscape really are being guided by our understanding of natural forest systems and how those operate. And we're using that to really be a model for our stewardship. But the second key piece is it recognizes that we're part of that ecosystem and that we have values and needs and other factors that forest provides. And so when we're thinking about our stewardship and our interaction with that ecosystem, we're doing it in ways that both are supporting us and what we need, but also trying to support the forest. And so throughout the history of ecological forestry, really a lot of that message of both understanding the ecosystem as well as understanding our role in that and both how our material and immaterial uses affect our both values tied to that ecosystem and how we interact with that are pretty key. So you can advance to the next slide. And so most often think when we're going to talk about the history of something in forestry, it's going to begin in Europe or begin at Yale or one of our kind of older institutions in the US. But most that have had an opportunity to understand and learn from Indigenous partners about their relationship with the forest and the way to think about our role in both kind of using as well as giving back in how we interact with ecosystems is really critical and very consistent with how we now think about ways in which we might do ecological forestry across our diverse forests. So this quote from Kat Anderson from her great book, kind of highlighting just the perspective on tribal nations in California and their interaction with their environment, really, I think, underpins a lot of what we're trying to do with ecological forestry. We want to both recognize that we use things from the forest, but that we also want to preserve and sustain the amazing ecosystems they are. And so to do that, we need this complex knowledge as well as complex practices to really sustain those and really complement those areas where we're leaving things alone. So you can advance to the next slide. But if we look at Western kind of forestry training and really the roots of ecological forestry in forestry literature, independent of this being an event that's tied to Harvard Forest, I'd have the exact same slide to give credit to the history of ecological forestry really coming from our region, and in particular for both Richard Fisher as well as Steve Spur and Al Klein, who are grad students of his at the time, that really were observing kind of the response of the forest to kind of a top-down command and control approach to things, really trying to force kind of their will as opposed to listening to the forest, and ultimately recognize that maybe we should be using nature as a guide to actually influence our stewardship and really follow that across the landscape. And so I think this quote on the bottom left is quite telling in that even at the time when they were advancing this idea of ecological forestry, they were lamenting that much of what we were viewing as kind of forest practices and the way to kind of meet our needs was very much as planting of pine. And I would argue that in many cases we're still existing in that context. Next slide, please. But when we think about ecological silviculture and where that kind of sits within our landscape and the history of that, many really think about the Pacific Northwest as the place where this came from. And then I would argue that the popularization of ecological forestry, the reason why it showed up in the forestry textbooks I was using when I was being trained in forestry, really was kind of the global significance of changes happening in the landscape in the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s. In particular, those that are familiar with the timber wars of that time period, really pitting old growth conservation versus kind of the desire to maximize production over a large area of that landscape for global wood needs. And so Jerry Franklin and several others really were kind of viewed as the centerpiece of this new way of thinking and what was called new forestry at the time. And this quote, I think, is really critical and I think very important to reflect on even today, in that Franklin and others were arguing, this whole idea of either preserving or getting maximum use really is not productive, and that there should be this central place where we actually share that forest pie and try to find ways to actually sustain the values that ecosystems provide, while at the same time deriving some of those uses that we've been talking about. And so this sharing of the pie is something I think we still struggle with today. And I would argue on the polarization in the discourse we have, even in our region, sometimes gets into this kind of dividing versus sharing perspective. Next slide, please. Ironically, 3 years later, we actually had a really, I think, innovative and thoughtful way of trying to divide and also share that pie in our region. Others on the panel today will talk about the triad, and some people are familiar with that. And it's been interesting to see just, more recently how much more attention has been given to something that's been around for over 30 years. And really, I think was a nice articulation of how to actually share that pie. And those familiar with this triad approach really focused in on both having wildlands where we're sustaining kind of those ecological values from areas without extractive human uses. At the same time, areas that are being devoted to like high levels of timber production to offset our consumptive needs. And then more broadly, this area where we actually are sharing the pie is this new forestry, those places where we're both managing for wood products, but also managing for many other values. And so we'll just argue that we already had a pretty good model and in many cases early additions of wildlands and woodlands in this approach. Next slide, please. So there are kind of four main principles we think about in terms of kind of guiding our approach to ecological forestry. And this really does relate back to thinking about what are we leaving for the forest and how are we supporting different forest functions while still recognizing that we are interacting with that forest and using that forest for our lives. And so the first principle really gets around that idea of kind of the giving and the taking. If we are actually going to be, removing trees, are we also thinking about what are we leaving in that forest for, future structure and function? And so this idea of biological legacies and really that, having this continuity over time. Likewise, as opposed to the pines and lines that the Harvard Forest was upset with even in the 1940s, trying to do the complete opposite. When we're engaging with ecosystems, recognizing their complexity and recognizing their diversity, and trying to actually both restore that as well as sustain that through our management interventions. Similarly, when we think of how natural systems develop, it's very different than how our mind works as it relates to decision making. And so actually doing management in ways that are consistent with how long it might take for a large old tree to grow, how long does it take for a certain species to disperse across the landscape. And so trying our best to balance kind of economic and social constraints with what does the ecosystem need to develop and evolve over time. And then finally, the triad's a good example of this, but even kind of management on large public ownerships as well, where we're thinking about how does this stewardship really influence the structure of that landscape. And so as we plan for wildlands and woodlands, how do we do that in ways that can balance across the region? So last slide. So when we look at our ecosystems, again, there are many things about those ecosystems that are just important to protect and preserve, but we are central to this. We really rely on forests, and they're a big part of both where we get material as well as immaterial values. And so the quadrants above just kind of highlight some of the main ecosystem services that we think of coming from our forests. And if we were to boil this down into how that intersects with a model like the triad, the upper left-hand quadrant provisioning really is only being supported by, alone by the high yield plantations. There's really not much else from those plantations that's intersecting with, regulating, cultural supporting in major ways. Likewise, ecological reserves did an amazing job with 3 of these quadrants, right? So we're not getting wood products from them, but they're definitely providing those other values. And I would argue really ecological forestry kind of is the one approach where we can actually try to address all 4 of these main areas we care about, both the material needs from the forest as well as trying to support all these other values. And so to me, the central place that it exists today, and I think the wide interest in the topic really reflects that it's a place where we can both certainly engage with our consumptive uses, but do it in ways that we're trying to support all these other values and all these other attributes of forest that we know are important both for us as well as for the other species that depend upon them. Last slide. So we're going to get into many discussions of how people interpret ecological forestry, but I think the key piece is that it's an approach where we're actually leaving something for the forest, but also recognizing our role in both supporting that ecosystem as well as understanding ways in which we can kind of own our consumerism and feel good about kind of giving back to the forest and supporting those values over time. So Brian Donahue is going to get into kind of thinking more about how we can factor this into our larger wood needs in the region. And so I'll turn it over to the next panelist, Brian.
Thanks. Go ahead with the next one, Marissa. Thanks. So for many of us, ecological forestry is part of a larger integrated approach to conservation in New England. Next, please. As Liz mentioned, that larger vision includes ecologically managed farmlands, urban community gardens and forests, sustainable fisheries, all tied together and supporting each other socially and ecologically. Most notably, the forest part of this vision includes wildlands. Sure, next slide. Covering at least 10% of the landscape, as was laid out in wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and community. Now, embedded wildlands are a necessary part of ecological forestry. In this forum, we're going to be focusing obviously on the actively managed part. We've delved into the passively managed wildlands piece many times in other places. Next slide. And next. So the question I want to address this morning is, could ecological forestry produce all the wood we need in New England or indeed in the US as a whole? Well, we looked into this question for New England last year in Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. There's 3 co-authors on this call, David and Tony and me. Caitlin Littlefield was our lead author. The short answer is yes, we could quite easily in theory, but quite difficult in practice. It would require a major transformation in how our forests are managed. Next, please. So today, in spite of being 80% forested, New England produces only about 3/4 of the wood it consumes, and only about half of the lumber. And most of that's coming from Maine, obviously, and being consumed in southern New England. Next, please. We suggested 3 steps to remedy this situation in the coming decades. First is to protect almost all of our remaining forest, all that we possibly can, and to concentrate development so that at least 70% of the landscape is protected. And again, at least 10% of that in wild reserves. And our analysis showed there could be room for as much as 20% or even more. Secondly, reduce wood consumption by 25%. Now, paper consumption has been declining for 2 decades. Lumber consumption could decline even while meeting our housing needs by building more of the smaller workforce housing and multi-unit housing we need. And third, increase the practice of ecological forestry. And in New England, if we did that to 60% of our forest, or half of our landscape as a whole, that would balance the books for New England on wood production and consumption. Next, please. So there's a graph showing that you could delve into if you check out that publication. Next, please. This transformation would mean several decades of decreased production in the industrial forests of northern New England, allowing forests to grow and investing in thinning, leading in time to increased and higher quality timber production. New England Forestry Foundation and others have shown how this can work. At the same time, it would mean increased production from the family forests of central and southern New England. Next slide, please. You can see the the red is the industrial forest in the north, about a quarter of the region, and all that green is the mostly family forests through central and southern New England, the blues public forest. So owners have traditionally been very reluctant to cut in the family forest area, but if they were to practice ecological forestry aiming at long-term timber rotation in the same kind of way, these measures could give us all the woods we need. And as Tony was saying, that nice diversity of habitat as the practices are carried out. So next slide. Those are all from our farm. Next slide, just a variety of nice forest habitats. One more. Fine seed tree cut there. Okay, next. And even the next. In fact, the United States as a whole has enough forests to provide all the wood we need through ecological forestry if you just sort of do the math. So to show how this works, I'm going to take you very quickly through our forest, which is managed with ecological forestry, next by Lincoln Fish and some very skillful low-impact loggers. That's a hemlock stand. We discovered you can take supposedly low-grade timber, like hemlock black birch and crooked black cherry, and build a very nice house. So, next slide. We add the kids to the skidder for traction. Next, please. Hemlock on the landing. Next. Yarding up the hemlock logs. Next. Band sawmill, joists, 2-bys, 1-bys. Next. Putting the frame together. Next. Raising the frame. Next. Finished house. Those are all local woods from our wood lot. Hemlock, cherry, birch, and some sugar maple. So if you want to read more about what I've just illustrated, next slide. It's in my book, Slow Wood. After that shameless plug, I'll pass it on to Rick Morrill. Next.
Thanks, Brian. I think you can flip to next slide, starting slide, Marissa. Oh. Great, thank you. Well, thanks to Liz and company for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I need to offer one quick correction to the introduction. Despite, maybe you can see the gray in my beard, despite that, I don't have 50 years of time in the woods myself, but Ross Morgan, my father-in-law, does. So that credit needs to go to Ross. So to me, forestry is fundamentally about the future. And forestry is fundamentally about balance. And that concept of balance is really at the heart of ecological forestry and sustainability. Next slide. For example, foresters strive to balance age class distributions under both even-aged and multi-age models. Next. And we try to balance growth and removals. Next. We attempt to balance financial returns with other forest values that often lack conventional economic metrics. Next. And to bring this idea to the current moment, let's talk about housing. I think Brian's nicely brought that into the discussion here. And in Vermont and much of the region, we're experiencing acute housing shortages. I think everyone's read those headlines. So as Brian has pointed out, houses are made of wood. Next. In my county here in Vermont, of about 30,000 people, it's projected we need to add 1,000 new homes before 2030. This will require 2,000 to 3,000 truckloads of logs that look like this. And this is for just one rural county in a rural state. Next. As the Beyond the Illusion report suggests, this wood can and should come from forests in our region. Next. At the same time, we need to balance this wood production and extraction with other values like water quality, wildlife habitat, and recreation. Next. But achieving this kind of balance is hard. I think that's should be apparent from the previous presenter slides. It requires we attend to the details and nuance of the forest and our management actions. And I think it's plausible to assume that the challenges around balance are likely one reason for the slow adoption of ecological forestry by the forestry profession, by landowners, and the public at large. Next. We as humans, when faced with complexity and nuance, I think often gravitate towards a simplified black and white view of the world, a view that can lead to maximizing just one value like profit, like carbon, like recreation, at the expense of all other values. And the result is that we simplify things. We simplify the ecology of forest systems, we simplify our relationship with those forests, and we risk losing our balance in the process. Next. Fortunately, we have strategies to achieve or maintain balance. And Tony has already mentioned the triad concept. So first proposed by Seymour and Hunter in 1991 as a way to balance wood production and ecological protection. So the system has three types of management. Next. One, the reserve areas that are passively managed, where we allow natural processes to govern the forest. Next. And two, intensive management areas, typically using a plantation model. And importantly, these zones can help make up for that lost wood production from passive management zones. Next. Third, the matrix forest. It's managed under ecological forestry principles, where management actions can occur across a spectrum of silvicultural approaches and intensities. Next. Importantly, the ratio of these three management zones is flexible. but the matrix forest will always occupy the majority of acres, and ideally the intensive management area would cover the fewest. So this practical yet elegant framework offers one of our best methods to attain balance in our stewardship of the forest. Next. And it can work at a range of scales and ownership types, from industrial lands to small woodlots. The triad offers the flexibility to match a range of scenarios while providing enough structure to ensure balanced outcomes. And if the triad's of interest, I definitely recommend reading the original publication by Seymour and Hunter, as well as a more recent one from 2022 by Austin Himes, tracing 30 years of the triad. Next slide. Last, I want to emphasize that if we're to achieve balance in our management of the forest, we need to start from a place of humility. We don't have all the answers or even all the facts, and we must be prepared to learn and adapt in perpetuity. Thank you for the chance to present here, and now we'll hear from Annie Sochi-Maloney and Guy Dunkel.
Thank you so much, Rick. That is a wonderful segue. The Foundation for Sustainable Forests. We are proud members of the Forest Stewards Guild, and humility is a it's frequently brought up in our work. If I could have my starting slide, please. So the Foundation for Sustainable Forests, we're based in northwestern Pennsylvania, and we practice ecological forestry on the 3,700 acres of forested land that we have conserved over time. And we absolutely view ecological forestry as a critical tool to our work, because Pennsylvania in general, it's 60% forested. A much higher percentage than that of those forests are privately owned by small private landowners. And somewhat in contrast to what Brian was discussing in terms of the further northeast in New England, our forest landowners, there's a strong tradition of being able to or expecting to receive some form of income through periodic harvests in their woods. And traditionally, those harvests have taken the form of single tree selection, high grades, taking the healthiest, largest, most vigorous trees out of the woods for economic means, but then not necessarily prioritizing or not prioritizing at all the ecological results of that harvest. And so the Foundation for Sustainable Forests, on the lands that we have conserved and through our outreach to forest landowners that surround us, we are seeking to sort of disrupt that status quo, to introduce forest health and more vigor to the landscape, to prepare for whatever changes lie ahead. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a very, very simple overarching description of what we're aiming for in our forestry. So we seek, through ecological forestry, we're seeking to balance the human needs of the forest in an area that has a strong legacy of human activity in our woods with the ecological needs of the forest. And so this is just a broad snapshot of what we're trying to accomplish. Overall, elevating the vigor of the forest overall, the individual trees, by basically disrupting that history of single tree selection, which historically would create, we basically have a middle-aged forest problem in our woods. We have a closed canopy. It favors shade-tolerant trees in the understory. And we're seeking to introduce more diversity by strategically introducing pockets of light to the forest floor, which Guy will talk about in a moment, and also age and structural diversity, all of which are more conducive to diversifying habitat for wildlife. And so, again, I want to emphasize that we see ecological forestry as a really important tool in these systems that have a strong history of human intervention. And we're trying to provide landowners with better knowledge and tools of how their management can actually enhance ecological condition and not just achieve economic results. And I also want to mention that ecological forestry, one of the tools that we use is knowing when not to do something, when the forest simply needs time to recover from whatever its prior disturbance was. So with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Guy, who works alongside our founder, Troy Firth, to actually manage these forests on the ground, to give you a sense of what that looks like for us.
Thank you, Annie. As Annie mentioned, the Foundation for Sustainable Forests is a nonprofit land trust, and we currently own and steward about 3,700 acres of forest land in a couple of states near northwestern Pennsylvania, southwestern New York. Annie mentioned that we're managing with some goals such as high tree vigor, structural complexity, species diversity, things like that. And what that looks like for us in practice is really a system of low intensity but high frequency thinnings and harvests. We find that those maintain a more constant light level on the forest floor. And because there's more light on the forest floor, it helps to keep the understory filled with plants, and also those plants have pretty high vigor. And so that filled understory just provides less opportunity for invasive plants to establish themselves. Also, the high vigor of the plants means that the deer browse pressure on forest understory, the plants are able to bounce back from the deer browse pressure a little bit better, and that deer browse pressure is distributed amongst just a higher number of stems. So in face of just the changing ecology of forests in our area, we found that this system helps buffer against some of those impacts. It's also important to note that the high frequency of our harvests kind of enables us to expand upon desirable outcomes. If we cut a few trees scattered across the landscape and that results in some establishment of healthy regeneration, and we want to capture that opportunity because we'll be back on site in a few years, we're really able to roll with the opportunities as they present themselves. And the low intensity of the harvests allows us to also tap the brakes if the outcome that we see is not desirable, such as most commonly the establishment of invasive plants. Just wanted to finalize with a comment. Working across these 3,700 acres with a very wide variety of history and land use history and management history. One thing I would note, of the forests I work in, I think that there's a positive correlation between high structural complexity and species diversity and the frequency of disturbances and harvests. And that gives me hope that we do have a way to positively influence some of those factors through proper stewardship. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pass to our next presenter, Sam Brown. Thank you all.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, everybody, today for doing this conference. It's really exciting to see so many people. I don't have any slides, so you can just have to look at my happy face here. I often wonder about the future and how to balance the forest with the past and the present. And my focus today as a landowner and a forester is, one, to keep up with the decline in mortality in my woods as appropriate for long-term ecological forestry, as we've been discussing already today. And it's been a wonderful short course in this, all the silviculture. And two, as a landowner, I'm trying to figure out how to protect the few hundreds of acres that I've had the privilege of tending over these past decades from the pressures of the marketplace in the future. I'm a small operator and work alone for the most part in central Maine. I don't cut pulpwood anymore on my own land. I leave it in the woods because for me, it costs more to move it than to just drop it. When I first started working in the Maine woods about 50 years ago, pulpwood mentality dominated the scene because of the many pulp mills throughout the state as the primary market for wood. There are lots of small operators like myself in business with a pickup truck, a saw, a small tractor, or even horse and a small truck. But in the early 70s, mid 70s, and quickly the mechanization changed the equation, taking most of the back-breaking work out of pulpwood. We were cutting 4-foot wood and throwing it around by hand. to hydraulics and other mechanization. But this was replacing muscle work with financial debt. Muscle power was no longer as important as cash flow, and the increased production kept the mill price low. Larger and larger machinery rapidly defined silvicultural practices instead of the reverse. Low profit, high risk is still the equation for loggers today, and in my opinion, large machinery debt forces more trees to be cut than are silviculturally necessary. That's one of the reasons we're here today, is to try to figure out how to make that change. From my perspective, the greatest challenge to the health of our forests is our consumptive global economic system. For the most part, trees are only valued when they're cut off their roots. And I say this despite recent attempts at carbon markets to monetize that value. And I may not have all the details of current things, but the ecosystem functions of forests cannot be replaced by economic means. The industrial ownership and management of land seems to me to create impossible demands for profit. When the price of borrowing money exceeds the rate of photosynthesis, which is the root of all life here on Earth, if the sun's energy gives us 2 to 5% of biomass a year, that should define our annual allowable cut. To be perpetually balanced, we can't exceed our solar energy inputs. Changing economic pressures from short-term to long-term is key and will obviously require a nearly total shift in thought, perception, and action, which is slowly, inevitably, and painfully happening, as we're all here today witnessing. As a species, we are grudgingly acknowledging that we all live on one planet with no more frontiers to exploit. Individualism, useful as it has been in our past, has to assume a more proportional place in a revised economic system based on service, not on wealth accumulation. People have to develop a spiritual awareness of ourselves in the web of the planet, not apart from it, but deeply depending on and contributing to it. We all humbly influence each other. I've really enjoyed this collection of thoughts and experiences, and thanks for letting me be a part. And now we'll hear from David Foster.
Hey, thanks so much, Sam. And thanks to all of the authors for contributing their thoughts to From the Ground Up and to this forum today. I've learned an awful lot in this process. So to my mind, the essence of ecological forestry is not so much about the tools we employ or the practices we follow. It's not even about trying to mimic natural process, as if removing wood from a forest could ever mimic what nature does. But to me, ecological forestry is about the worldview and the ethics that we bring to our work, as well as the community we involve in conducting that work. For me, the worldview needs to be ecocentric, a view that respects trees, forests, and all of nature for their inherent value. That attitude will lead us to minimize our impact and to start first by managing for natural process by making the explicit management decision to let nature be and to be free. Then when we're pursuing active management, ecological forestry should be humble, as we've heard from a few of the speakers. Instead of asking how we can employ our knowledge to help the forest, we might instead ask more about what we can learn from it. Instead of questioning how many wildlands are enough, we might ask how much human impact on the world is enough. But ecological forestry should also be a community enterprise in which the participants include the forester, the logger, the landowner, the forest as a community, and all other stakeholders. Ecological forestry is about giving respect to other people as well as to the land. So let me share a recent anecdote to illustrate what I mean. I'm involved in a contentious discussion. What discussions about forests aren't contentious? But this is about a state forest on Martha's Vineyard, where there's a proposal to clear cut and chip a surprisingly magnificent and diverse 90-year-old plantation of white pine. The intent is to create early successional, so-called fire-dependent vegetation. Now, some of my friends love that white pine forest, and many of my other friends love scrub oak barrens. To help open communications among disagreeing neighbors, all of whom love nature and its conservation, a community forum was recently held. I was invited and I joined and shared some scientific perspectives on either side. An argument for biodiversity on the one hand and for climate mitigation on the other. But then two other people spoke. The first was a member of the Wampanoag tribe, and though he reminded everyone that he spoke as an individual, he shared an indigenous perspective. White pine, he said, are deeply important to us, and they always have been. We treat pines as equals, and we bring them into our use with care. Now, his people have been on this island continuously for 10,000 years, and the most poignant question he raised was not about what should happen in this forest, but rather, why has there never been an effort to bring an indigenous voice to the management of this public land? The second person was a farmer who grew up on the island logging the surrounding state lands. He opposed the plan, not because he opposes logging, but because the approach would be so wasteful of the resource. He noted that none of the dozen or so residents who have actually logged these woods was ever brought into the discussion of what should their future be. Let's have a community conversation, he said, and then we loggers can help you accomplish any end. We can leave the forest intact. We can thin it to grow magnificently, or we can cut it progressively over decades to create a different future. But whatever we do, let's use this resource well. So as I left that forum that night, I recognized while I was focusing on science, that these two locals had brought a sense of ecological forestry to that discussion. Thanks very much for letting me be part of this. And now we'll turn back to Liz for some discussion and questions that you've all shared.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for sharing your perspective on this really important topic. I've learned a lot today as well. So we have a lot of questions that have come up, some of which have been answered, but I'm going to go through them and combine sort of similar questions and direct them to the person that I think might be best to address them. Someone asked if the forest management plan on my farm is focused on wildlife habitat. Now, I've heard many people say this, their focus is wildlife habitat. And is that focus, the focus on wildlife habitat, generally acceptable in today's ecological forestry? I'm going to say that, Rick, could you address that question?
I don't know if I can address it well, but I can say something. I think that wildlife habitat is critical piece that most foresters will integrate into their work. I don't think there's anything wrong with putting that front and center as the primary management goal. Assuming that we use the principles that Tony just illustrated in his talk, that we can, we can have a focus on wildlife habitat while still meeting the other ecological forestry reasons, rationales. So I guess I don't see it as a mutually exclusive thing. So if habitat is the focus, then the other components can still be a part of that effort. Now, if others want to comment on that.
Others want to weigh in on that? All right, we'll go on to the next question then. The question was, can you speak to the role that public lands play in promoting ecological forestry? And then it was also asked if anyone could comment on the Telephone Gap project, which is a project for management on federal lands in Vermont on the Green Mountain National Forest. And the person says, I have many friends who are vigorously opposed to it. What should I say? Tony, would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And I think, there's a lot of ongoing discussion, of course, ironically, a lot of changing support for the personnel that even steward those lands right now, given changes in the federal funding priorities. But I think when we look at public lands, particularly in the case of the Telephone Gap, that's U.S. Forest Service and the stewardship of those lands. Obviously, the goal there is they're trying to balance the many values, both for folks in Vermont, but really it's held in the trust for citizens of the U.S. So somebody even in Indiana, is supposed to be benefiting from what happens on a national forest. And so a lot of the conversation today around ecological forestry and the challenges to making that a reality often do come down to the economic constraints that are often placed, particularly on being able to leave something for the forest when you're a private landowner, whether it's large or small, while also recouping the economic value you need to sustain that system into the future. And so one thing I think is often overlooked with public lands is that you don't have this overriding, at least public lands like a national forest, this overriding goal historically being the last 10 years of maximizing profit. Like when they're doing management on a national forest, it's fitting into a larger planning process that has involved, tens of people that have expertise, not just in forests, to David's point, but wildlife biologists, archaeologists, soil scientists, cultural experts. And so it's bringing to bear a lot of these perspectives on any stump that's cut out in that forest. And so public lands, from my perspective, really are the land base in many cases because of the lower emphasis placed on economic return, as well as the greater involvement, both of many people that are thinking about that forest from diverse perspectives, not just foresters, not just loggers, not just, forever wild conservation groups that really can, I think, provide this balanced approach that's trying to both, protect areas of most of our wildlands in New England, at least in Vermont, New Hampshire, are on national forests, as well as to, think about how to thoughtfully manage in those places they do cut stumps. And so those have become obviously the flashpoint for a lot of discussions. But if you look at the volume of wood cut in our region from public lands, it's really, a very small percentage of wood production. And so in many cases, a lot of where wood is coming from, particularly kind of larger corporate ownerships, is doing anything but ecological forestry. And so I often get a little bit bewildered as to why there's so much scrutiny on the places we actually are putting a lot of thought into relative to the places where they're maybe far enough away from where folks recreate or where they spend time to think about where much of our wood comes from. So public lands, I think are a great opportunity, but they're not a monolith. There are public lands that aren't fantastic, but the Telephone Gap and the resolution on that, Jamie Fidel kind of gave a summary of that in the from the ground up issue. I think that really highlights that process of bringing in different perspectives and coming to a compromise that I think really reflects, the principles we were talking about today.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for that perspective. We had another question that I'll address to David and others if they want to weigh in, which is how much of forests do you think should be permanently preserved, considering that we are rapidly moving past climate change tipping points and in consideration of E.O. Wilson's half-Earth concept and the related 30 by 30 by 30 proposal, keeping at least a third of our land in a wild, undisturbed state? And you, having developed the vision of wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities, might be well equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and probably most of the people on this screen have spent some time thinking about how one might go about that. Let me start with just the kind of practical observation or the approach that kind of we have taken. We actually started the what's now wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities basically from that question, basically asking, did it make sense to take sizable areas of, at that point, we were looking mostly at Massachusetts, but then all of New England and the Northeast, and take these lands which had such a lengthy history of human activity, both pre-European and of course with the intensity of European activity, and decide to manage them passively and set them aside. And that was the first question that we focused on, and we very rapidly came to the answer that yes, it did. And we pointed to places like the White Mountain National Forest, where wilderness areas had been established in completely cut over and burned over landscapes that now were thriving in new forests. And so then the question was, well, or the point was made, well, it only made sense to do that if you could embed those areas that would be operating freely and naturally in well-managed woodlands. And so out of that grew this larger concept of, well, what does the whole landscape look like? But then you come back and we did not have an assessment of how much wildland or forest reserves existed in New England. There was no way to easily get that number back in 2005 when we asked this question. And so we looked at the state of Massachusetts and decided that it was quite reasonable and quite practical to say that 10% of the area should be set aside in this way. And at that point, that was a hugely aspirational goal. In fact, it still is an aspirational goal. But over time, we've modified our thinking on that quite a bit. And Brian Donahue alluded to the most recent kind of calculation we took. And this is another approach to answering this question. And that is, we look to see, well, how much of New England's wood could be satisfied by ecological and good forestry being undertaken in New England. And we decided that if that goal was met, that still was possible to set aside 20 or 25% of the landscape, the region, in wildland reserves that are passively managed. So those are two approaches. And then, of course, the final approach would be to actually flip that on the back side and to start by saying, well, how many wildlands do we need? And then having established those, how much room is left for actively managed, well-managed forests. And we've not made that calculation, but it's by taking those different approaches and thinking of how we can maximize the amount of land that we leave without management that I think we are going to be doing the best for ourselves and for the earth.
Thanks, David. Thanks. I want to go to Annie and Guy now, and there's a couple of questions that you can answer. One is, someone asked, what about invasives? A lot of the discussion here was about managing to cutting trees and when and how and creating gaps and so forth. And you talked a lot about frequency of return, but what about invasive species, pests and pathogens, and these things through a lens of climate change and especially species migration? I guess I'll put that question to the two of you. Go ahead.
I'll start, but then I'll pass it on to Guy, if that's okay, Guy. I think it's a great question, and we often overlook in our description of our forestry how much investment we have made before any sort of a harvest is talked about. In many cases, as we acquire forests, they are in different stages of health or need for restoration. And there are many, many occasions where there is a need for some work, non-commercial work on the ground, such as herbicide application on multiflora rose or Japanese barberry, or simply cutting grapevines. And we do consistent with ecological forestry, keep the big picture in mind. And we're not trying to eradicate all the grapevines. That's an important food source, right? But we're trying to establish areas where we can promote regeneration. And once that regeneration is established, that's when we talk about doing some sort of a overstory removal or harvest to encourage that regeneration or allow it to succeed. Guy, do you want to add to that?
Maybe it's helpful if I reemphasize the idea of trying to create a forest understory that is well filled with desirable native wildflowers, tree seedlings, etc., provides less opportunity for the establishment of invasive plants. To Annie's point, certainly that does happen, and there are times where we need to address that and control those invasive plants. But we know the disturbance is inevitable, whether it's something that we have created intentionally or something that happens through a natural process. And when the forest understory tends to be open without plants in place, that's where we've seen the biggest negative impacts, where a large infestation of invasive plants will move in. And so just creating competition for invasive plants through these small introductions of sunlight on a regular basis. It's not that we don't have invasive plants, but they're a small percentage of the total understory. And that we find that to be helpful. Also with deer browse pressure, which is another kind of human-created issue that our forests face here in Pennsylvania.
I just also want to say, functionally speaking, we pay for that sort of work through some small part of it is NRCS contracts, but we're kind of a landowner like anybody else and can only qualify for so much. But a worst first thinning in one area, we can take the net revenue from that, from the low grade material that we sell there to help pay for investments in another area of the forest that has an invasive plant problem. So I just want to acknowledge that cost is an issue, and we make investments in one part of the forest and fund them with management in other parts of our forest.
Thank you both. Sam, it was asked, is it important that the public understand ecological forestry? And if so, why? I know you've done a lot of work with MOFGA, and what's your thought on that? And then we'll have to close.
I'm sorry,
Thanks.
my internet. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, is it important that the general public understand what ecological forestry is and its contribution to our overall, the overall functioning of the landscape and the forest economy? I know you work with landowners a lot and the public. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is an interest I think I always overestimate how much people know about natural processes. And so when we do work with when MOFGA we have a big fair every year, and during the year also have some workshops, and it's surprising to me how much interest there is in just the fundamental aspects of forestry, that just identifying tree species and so forth, that everybody here today, we're at a pretty high level, but I think most people, at least that there's a lack of general ecological knowledge on how species interact, and that we just try to do it the best we can at MOFGA when by starting at elementary levels. And I don't know if that answers the question, but
It's wonderful that you do that. It is just fabulous. We have so many more questions. I wish we could stay for another half hour. Everyone, thank you so much for all of this. And we will be following up with the talk has been recorded, and you'll see a recording of that. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists very much for being here, for sharing your knowledge, and Marissa for organizing all of us. Marissa, do you have any final comments?
I want to say thank you everyone for coming. If you have follow-up questions and you'd like to share them with us, please do so on the From the Ground Up website. I'll put the link in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.